The mountains were daggers against a bruised gray sky. Snow wasn't just falling. It was an assault, a thick white curtain trying to smother the world and every sound in it. The wind screamed through the pines, a raw, wounded sound that cut right to the bone. Through it all, a woman walked. Eleanor Hayes held her daughter so tight she could feel the child's ribs against her own. Every step was a battle, her legs plunging knee-deep into the unforgiving snow. Her fingers were numb, barely able to grip the bundle of wool and shawls that held her world. Clara's little face was pressed into her neck, the only place shielded from the ice in the air. "Stay with me, Clara," Eleanor whispered, her breath turning to a ghost in the wind. "Just a little longer, my love. Just a little longer." But Clara hadn't made a sound in over an hour. She hadn't even shivered. And Eleanor knew, with the cold certainty of a mother's dread, what that meant. She knew it just as she knew the town of Silver Creek was miles behind them now, its doors and its hearts slammed shut. "We don't help Indian lovers here," the doctor had spat, his eyes never once landing on Clara's feverish face. "Take your half-breed somewhere else." She'd knocked on every door, begged for medicine, for a warm corner, for a shred of decency. But Silver Creek had passed its judgment on her long ago, the day she chose to love James Stormcloud. A sob clawed its way up her throat. She could see his smile, hear the gentle rhythm of his Cheyenne songs, feel the strength in his arms. He'd saved that town one winter, brought them deer when their own supplies ran out. None of it mattered. They beat him while she screamed, his blood a terrible flower blooming on the white snow. The shopkeeper's sons held her back, their hands like iron bands on her arms. The memory gave her fury. Fury gave her strength. She took another step, then another. Her foot caught on something hidden, a root or a rock buried deep. She pitched forward, twisting her body in a desperate, last-second instinct to shield Clara from the fall. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her ankle. She lay there for a moment, the snow a cold leech against her skin, and thought, "This is it. This is where we die." Then she saw it. Through the swirling blizzard, a tiny flickering light. A pinprick of orange in a world of gray and white. A cabin tucked against the side of the mountain with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. Hope. It was a fire in her veins. Eleanor clawed her way back to her feet. She put her weight on the injured ankle and nearly screamed, but she bit her lip until she tasted blood and forced herself forward. 5 steps. 10. The light grew, a beacon calling her home. As she stumbled closer, she looked down at Clara. The child's lips were the color of a faint bruise. Snowflakes dusted her long, dark lashes, and they didn't melt. Eleanor's numb fingers fumbled at her daughter's neck, searching, praying for the faint thrum of a pulse. Nothing. "No," she whispered. It was a sound with no air behind it. She tried again, louder. "No, no, no, Clara, baby, wake up." She shook the small body, gently at first, then with a frantic desperation that bordered on violence. "Please, Clara, please." But the little girl was still, so terribly still. Her face was as peaceful and cold as the landscape that was trying to claim them both. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, just yards from the cabin door. She hugged Clara's body to her chest, rocking, a low guttural wail tearing from her throat. The wind snatched the sound and ripped it to shreds, carrying it away into the endless white. She didn't know how long she knelt there, a statue of grief in the heart of the storm. It could have been minutes. It could have been a lifetime. Finally, she stood. Her legs were numb, moving on their own. Her mind was a hollowed-out cavern of cold and sorrow. She reached the door and raised a fist. 3 weak taps, pathetic against the storm's fury. No answer. She knocked again, harder, leaning her weight into the rough-hewn wood. "Please," she croaked, her voice shattering. "Please, help us." The door swung open so suddenly she nearly fell inside. A man stood there. He was tall, with a wild beard that covered half his face and eyes like chips of flint. Warmth and firelight spilled out around him, an impossible island in the frozen world. His flannel sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms thick with muscle and laced with old, faded scars. His gaze dropped from Eleanor's ravaged face to the bundle in her arms, and something shifted in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was something else. Recognition. Or maybe a memory rising like a ghost. "My daughter," Eleanor managed, the words like swallowing glass. She looked down at Clara's still face. "She's—" The word wouldn't come. She took a shuddering breath. "Please, help me bury her." The man just stared. His flint-like eyes seemed to bore right through her, seeing every mistake, every loss, every last ounce of her pain. Then slowly, he reached for the bundle. His hands, calloused and huge, hesitated for a fraction of a second, hovering over the child. With movements that were shockingly gentle, he peeled back the layers of wet wool. Clara's face was revealed, pale and perfect as a porcelain doll. Snow crystals clung to her dark lashes. Her lips were blue. Her skin had the waxy sheen of a candle. The man touched her cheek with one rough finger. Then he bent his head down close, his wild beard brushing against the child's face. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, just under her jawline, holding them there. His eyes closed. He was utterly still, a statue of concentration. Then, without a word of warning, he snatched the child from Eleanor's arms. "She's not dead," he rasped, his voice rough and cracked from disuse. "Get inside. Close the door." Eleanor stood frozen, the words echoing in the empty space in her arms. Not dead. The man was already moving, striding toward the massive stone fireplace, laying Clara's tiny body on a wooden table beside it. He moved with a brutal efficiency, tearing at the wet clothes, his hands sure and steady. "Close the door!" he roared, not looking at her. "Now!" The command shattered her shock. She stumbled inside, slamming the heavy door against the storm. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the man's sharp, decisive movements. "She's not," Eleanor whispered, the hope so fragile it hurt to breathe. "She can't be." "She's barely breathing," the man said, his back to her. "But she is breathing. Hypothermia. Water in the lungs. How'd she get wet?" "The river," Eleanor stammered, her legs trembling as she moved closer. "The ice. It broke. I pulled her out, but—" He nodded once, a curt, sharp gesture. He didn't need the rest of the story. He continued working, wrapping Clara in dry, rough blankets he pulled from a nearby chest. Then he did something that made Eleanor gasp. He uncorked a small flask and tipped a few drops of dark, amber liquid between Clara's blue lips. "What are you doing?" Eleanor lunged forward, but her injured ankle buckled. She cried out, catching herself on the edge of the table. "Whiskey," the man said, not bothering to look up. "Stimulates the heart. Sit down before you fall down." Eleanor ignored the command, her eyes fixed on his hands, his movements. "You're a doctor." A shadow, dark and quick, passed over his face. "I was a nurse. Army. The war." He pressed his ear to Clara's small chest, listening. He stayed like that for a long time. Finally, he looked up, his flinty eyes meeting hers for the first time. "Her heartbeat is faint, but it's steady. She's fighting." He held her gaze. "She's strong." Those 3 words, they broke something inside her. A dam of grief and terror and exhaustion she'd been holding back for days, for months, for years. The tears came, hot and silent, streaming down her face. Her legs finally gave out completely. The man caught her before she hit the floor. His grip was like iron, but he guided her to a wooden chair by the fire as if she weighed nothing at all. "Thank you," she wept, the words coming out in ragged sobs. "Thank you. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said, his voice a low growl. He turned back to Clara. "She's not out of danger." Eleanor watched through a blur as the man worked. He was a machine of healing. He rubbed Clara's tiny limbs, his strokes firm but gentle, working to bring the life back into them. He elevated her feet. He placed stones, heated by the fire and wrapped in cloth, near her body but never touching her skin. Every action was precise, practiced, perfect. "What's your name?" she asked, after the silence had stretched for what felt like hours. The man paused, his hands stilling over Clara's chest. He seemed surprised by the question, as if he'd forgotten he even had a name. "Samuel," he said at last. "Samuel Reed." "I'm Eleanor Hayes," she said. "She's Clara." Samuel nodded once. That was all. He returned his focus to the child, his entire world narrowing to the space on that table. From a dark corner of the cabin, a low whine echoed. Eleanor started, her frayed nerves jumping. A dog, huge and old, rose from a pile of blankets. Its muzzle was gray with age, but its eyes were sharp, intelligent. It padded toward them, its nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. "Ranger," Samuel said, not looking up. "He won't hurt you." The dog came to Eleanor first, sniffing her outstretched hand with a cautious curiosity. Then, to her astonishment, he moved to the table. He put his front paws on the edge and peered at Clara, his great head tilted. He whined again, a soft, worried sound deep in his chest. "He knows," Samuel murmured, almost to himself. "He always knows." Eleanor didn't understand what he meant. She was too tired to ask. The heat from the fire was a drug, seeping into her frozen bones, making her aware for the first time just how close to death she had been. Her eyelids felt like lead weights. Her thoughts dissolved into a thick, warm fog. "Stay awake!" Samuel's command was as sharp as a slap. It cut right through the haze. "Your clothes are wet, too. You need to change." He jerked his head toward a chest in the corner. "In there. You'll find something dry." Eleanor forced herself to stand, her ankle screaming in protest. She limped to the chest and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were men's clothes neatly folded. They were too big for her, but they were clean and dry. As she pulled out a shirt, something underneath shifted. A small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The corner of a framed photograph peeked out. She looked away quickly, a hot flush of shame creeping up her neck. She was a guest here, an intruder. She had no right to his secrets. She grabbed a flannel shirt and a pair of wool trousers and turned back. Samuel was still bent over Clara, his broad back to her. "I'll step outside," he said without turning around. "Change. Quickly. The child needs you." Before she could answer, he was at the door and gone, letting in a brief, brutal gust of wind. She stripped off her wet dress, gasping as the cold air hit her skin. She pulled on the borrowed clothes, the fabric smelling of pine smoke and something else, something herbal and clean. As she rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, her eyes scanned the cabin. It was a place of stark simplicity. A narrow bed against one wall, the stone fireplace, a table covered not with food, but with medical tools, glass bottles of powders, jars of dried herbs, books stacked on a shelf, leather-bound medical texts, and on the mantelpiece, a silver pocket watch gleamed in the firelight. A knock at the door made her jump. "Decent?" Samuel called. "Yes," she answered, hastily tying a bit of twine around the trousers to hold them up. He came back in, a swirl of snow following him. His eyes took in her strange new attire with a quick, assessing glance, then immediately returned to Clara. The child's color was better. The terrible blue tint around her lips was fading, replaced by a faint, hopeful pink. "The snow's getting worse," Samuel said, checking Clara's pulse again. "You'll have to stay until it passes." "How long?" He shrugged, a gesture that encompassed the raw, unpredictable power of the mountains. "Days! Maybe a week!" Eleanor limped to Clara's side. She touched her daughter's cheek. It was still cold, but it was the cold of a living thing, not the frozen stillness of before. Tears pricked her eyes. "You hurt your ankle," Samuel observed. "It wasn't a question. It's just a twist." He knelt without asking. He lifted the hem of the too long trousers. His hands were surprisingly gentle as they probed the swollen joint. Her ankle was nearly twice its normal size, a knot of purple and blue. "Not broken. Bad sprain. Sit." He guided her back to the chair, then rummaged in a drawer. He came back with bandages and a tin of salve that smelled sharply of pine and mint. He wrapped her ankle with efficient clinical movements. His touch was careful, impersonal, but not unkind. "Thank you," she said when he was done. He just nodded and went back to Clara. The minutes bled into hours. The storm raged, the wind a constant scream at the shutters. Snow piled up against the windows, burying them in a white tomb. Inside, the fire was a steady, crackling heartbeat. Eleanor must have drifted off. She woke with a start to find a blanket draped over her shoulders. Samuel was at the table, grinding something in a small mortar and pestle, his movements rhythmic and focused. "Clara?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Sleeping," Samuel said, not looking up. "Naturally now. Her breathing is better." Eleanor struggled to her feet, wincing, and hobbled to the table. Clara was nestled in a cocoon of blankets, her little chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Her skin was warm. Her color was almost normal. Relief hit Eleanor like a physical blow, so powerful she had to grip the table to keep from collapsing. "How?" she whispered. "I was so sure." "She was close," Samuel said, his focus still on the herbs. "Very close. But children are resilient, and she's a fighter." Eleanor stroked Clara's dark hair, now dry and soft against her fingers. "What are you making?" "Tea. For when she wakes. It will help clear her lungs." She studied him now. Really studied him. In the flickering firelight, she could see he was younger than she first thought. Maybe in his late 30s. His hair and beard were long and untamed, but they were clean. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a world of sorrow. A thin white scar ran from his left temple down into his beard. His hands, though calloused and scarred, moved with the precision of a surgeon. "You said you were an army nurse," she said. His hand stilled for a beat. "During the war." "Which side?" He resumed grinding, the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone filling the silence. "Does it matter?" "No," she said quickly. "No, of course not. We didn't see much of the war out here." He made a non-committal sound and tipped the ground herbs into a pouch. "You should eat something," he said, abruptly changing the subject. "There's stew on the stove." She was suddenly, ravenously hungry. She hadn't eaten in what felt like days. She limped to the small iron stove, where a pot simmered, filling the cabin with a rich, meaty aroma. Her stomach growled, loud and shameless. Samuel handed her a bowl and a spoon without a word. It was just venison and potatoes and wild onions, but to Eleanor it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate, standing by the stove, watching him. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "About the herbs, the treatment." "Experience," he said shortly. "War teaches you things." She wanted to ask more, to understand the story behind the scars and the sorrow in his eyes. But there was a wall around him, solid and high. So instead, she just said, "I don't know how to thank you." He finally looked up, his pale eyes unreadable. "Don't," he said. "Not yet." The words hung between them, a cold reminder that Clara wasn't safe. Not yet. Eleanor nodded. After she finished, she returned to Clara's side, taking the small, warm hand in her own. "You should rest," Samuel said after a long while. "Take the bed. I'll watch her." Eleanor shook her head. "I want to be here when she wakes." He didn't argue. He moved around the cabin, his presence a quiet, steady thing. He added wood to the fire. He checked the shutters. Ranger followed him, a silent gray shadow. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, a fragile peace had settled. Eleanor fought sleep, but it was a losing battle. Her head drooped, her hand still clutching Clara's. She woke to a soft touch on her shoulder. "She's stirring," Samuel said quietly. Eleanor was instantly awake. Clara's eyelids were fluttering, her fingers twitched, and then, like the sun breaking through the darkest storm clouds, her eyes opened. They were deep brown, just like her father's, and they were filled with confusion. "Mama." The word was a thread of a sound, a bare whisper. But to Eleanor, it was a symphony. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." She gathered Clara into her arms, burying her face in the child's hair, the tears she'd held back for so long finally breaking free. "You're safe now. You're safe." Clara's gaze drifted past her mother, landing on the tall, bearded man who stood a few feet away. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice raspy. "That's Mr. Reed," Eleanor said, her voice thick with tears. "He helped you. You were very sick." Clara studied Samuel with the solemn, unguarded curiosity of a child. "Thank you," she said, her voice small but clear. Something flickered across Samuel's face again. Pain. A memory. It was there and gone in an instant. He gave a single curt nod, then turned away, busying himself with the tea he'd prepared. "Your daughter needs to drink this," he said, his back still to them. "It will help her cough." Eleanor took the cup. The liquid was dark and smelled bitter. She helped Clara sit up and held it to her lips. "It tastes bad," Clara complained after a sip. "I know, sweet one," Eleanor whispered, "but it will make you better." Clara drank the rest, making a face that, on any other day, would have made Eleanor laugh. Today, it just brought a fresh wave of grateful tears. Samuel moved about the cabin, giving them their moment. He checked the storm through a crack in the shutters. The wind still moaned, but it had lost some of its fury. "The storm is passing," he announced. "Another day, maybe, and the trails will be clear." Eleanor looked up, her heart lurching. "You want us to leave?" He wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's not safe for you here." "We have nowhere to go," she said, the words flat and heavy. "Silver Creek won't have us." "Why?" The question was blunt, direct. She glanced down at Clara, who had drifted off again, her breathing deep and even in Eleanor's arms. "My husband," she said quietly, "was Cheyenne, James Stormcloud." She told him everything, about how James had saved the town, about how they had fallen in love, about the secret marriage, and what happened when the town found out. "They killed him," Samuel finished for her, his voice devoid of emotion. Eleanor nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. "They said he'd bewitched me. They beat him to death in the town square. I was already carrying Clara. My father disowned me. The whole town. They turned their backs." She took a shaky breath. "Clara got sick 3 days ago. I took her to the doctor. He said he doesn't treat half-breeds." A muscle jumped in Samuel's jaw. "So you came here," he said. "I heard rumors. A hermit in the mountains. A healer. You were my last hope." She met his gaze, her own eyes fierce. "You saved her life." Samuel turned away, but not before she saw the raw, unmistakable pain in his eyes. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Both of you." He insisted she take the bed. He wouldn't hear any arguments. "You need your strength to care for her," he said. "I don't sleep much anyway." She laid Clara gently on the table, then limped to the narrow bed. As she sank onto the surprisingly soft mattress, she looked over at Samuel. He had taken her place on the stool, a silent sentinel watching over her daughter. His profile was harsh in the firelight, as weathered and unforgiving as the mountains outside. The last thing she saw before sleep finally claimed her was Samuel, reaching out to gently adjust the blanket around Clara's shoulders. His touch was as careful as if she were made of spun glass. When she woke, pale light was seeping through the shutters. For a panicked second, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The storm, the cabin, Samuel, Clara. She sat bolt upright. The table by the fire was empty. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She scanned the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw her. Clara was sitting on a bearskin rug by the hearth, pale but alert. She was stroking Ranger's big head, and the old dog was submitting to the attention with a look of profound patience. "Good morning," Samuel's voice came from the stove. "There's coffee." Eleanor swung her legs out of bed. The swelling in her ankle was down. She limped over to Clara, kneeling beside her. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" She pressed a hand to her daughter's forehead. It was cool. I'm hungry, Mama, Clara said, her voice stronger. And Mr. Reed's dog is nice. Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, the sound rusty and unfamiliar in her own ears. Those are both very good signs. She hugged Clara, burying her face in her hair, breathing in the miracle of her. Samuel appeared with a mug of coffee and a bowl of porridge. She should eat, he said, handing the bowl to Eleanor. Slowly, her stomach needs to adjust. As Clara ate, her mother's heart ached with a gratitude so deep it felt like a wound. "Thank you for taking care of us," she said to Samuel. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "You'd have found someone else," he cut in, turning his back to her. "Or made do." "No," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "We wouldn't have. You were our only hope." His shoulders tensed. He was silent for a long moment. Then, without turning, he asked, "Why did you think she was dead?" The question was like a punch. She stopped shivering. "She was so cold I couldn't find a pulse." Her voice broke. "I thought I'd lost her." He nodded slowly. "Hypothermia can mimic death. The body shuts down. The pulse becomes almost undetectable." "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you know she was still alive?" Samuel finally turned to face her. His expression was a fortress, but his eyes held a story he wasn't telling. "I've seen it before," he said simply. "In the war." Before she could press him, Clara tugged on her sleeve. "Mama, I'm tired again." "That's normal," Samuel said. "Her body is healing. She'll need a lot of rest." As Clara drifted back to sleep on the rug, Samuel knelt beside her, checking her pulse, his touch gentle and sure. "The fever hasn't returned," he murmured. "Good sign." "You're very good at this," Eleanor observed. "Being a healer." The shadow crossed his face again. "I was a field nurse. They needed men who could stomach blood. After the war, I stopped." He stood abruptly and turned to the window. "Snow's almost stopped. The trail should be clear by tomorrow." The day passed in a quiet rhythm. Samuel tended the fire, checked his traps, said little. Eleanor watched over Clara, her heart a tangled knot of gratitude and anxiety. Tomorrow they would leave. Tomorrow they would be on their own again, with nowhere to go. As evening fell, Clara woke, brighter and stronger than before. She accepted a cup of broth from Samuel with a shy, "Thank you, sir." His expression softened, just for a second. "You can call me Samuel, little one." Clara took a sip and smiled. "It's good. Better than Mama's." "Clara!" Eleanor exclaimed, embarrassed. But Samuel's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. "Your mother makes poor broth?" Clara nodded solemnly. "She burns it sometimes." "I see." He glanced at Eleanor, and she saw a flicker of humor in his guarded eyes. "Well, I'm sure your mother is good at other things." "She tells the best stories," Clara offered, "about brave warriors." She looked up at Samuel. "My father was a brave warrior. Mama says he could run faster than the wind." A heavy silence fell in the small cabin. Eleanor's throat tightened. "He sounds remarkable," Samuel said, his voice gentle. "He had to go away," Clara said with the simple, heartbreaking acceptance of a child. "To the spirit world." Samuel's eyes met Eleanor's, and in that look something passed between them, a shared understanding of loss. "I'm going to check the traps," he said suddenly, grabbing his coat. "Make sure we have dinner." He took his rifle and slipped out the door, Ranger at his heels. Left alone, Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair. "He's sad, Mama," Clara said, her voice small and certain. "Is he?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "Yes, like you were after Father went away, but worse." Eleanor pondered that. She looked around the sparse cabin at the medical books, the jars of herbs. Her eyes landed on the silver pocket watch on the mantel. On impulse, she stood and limped over to it. It was heavy, intricately engraved, not something a simple army nurse would own. She opened the case. Inside the cover, a single phrase was engraved in delicate script. "Para mi testigo." Maria, for my witness. Maria. It was a woman's name, his wife's name. The door flew open. Samuel stood there, a rabbit dangling from his hand. He stomped the snow from his boots, his eyes immediately finding her at the mantelpiece, finding the watch in her hand. His face became a mask of stone. He said nothing. He just looked at her, and the warmth that had begun to seep into the little cabin vanished, leaving a chill colder than the storm outside. She hastily put the watch back, her heart hammering. She had crossed a line. She had trespassed. "The storm's passing," he said, his voice flat. "The skies are clearing." He hung the rabbit on a hook and set about skinning it, his movements sharp and angry. That night, after a silent, tense dinner, he returned from checking the perimeter with a bundle of fresh pine boughs. "For the girl," he said, arranging them near where Clara slept. "The scent clears the lungs." The unexpected kindness, after the coldness of before, made Eleanor's voice thick. "You've been very kind. I know we disrupted your solitude." His hands stilled. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "I haven't spoken to another person in almost 2 years." The confession hung between them, raw and stark. "Not since Maria died," he added, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Was she your wife?" He nodded once, his profile rigid. "She was everything." He stared into the fire. "She was Mexican. Brilliant. Knew more about healing than any doctor I ever met. She taught me what I used to help your daughter." He seemed to retreat back into himself then, the wall going up again. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Eleanor wanted to ask more, but she didn't dare. She went to the bed, her mind reeling. Maria, a Mexican healer. What had happened to her? What had driven this gifted man into such a profound and sorrowful isolation? In the middle of the night, she woke to Clara's choked cry. It was a strangled, gasping sound. She scrambled from the bed, her ankle forgotten. But Samuel was already there, scooping Clara from the rug. The child's face was flushed a terrifying red, her breathing a harsh, ragged wheeze. "Fluid in the lungs," Samuel said, his voice grim. "Fever's back." Fear, cold and absolute, seized Eleanor. "What do we do?" "Steam, then herbs." He was already moving, carrying Clara to the stove, adding pine needles to a pot of boiling water. Hold her over it. Let her breathe it in. For the next hour, they fought for every breath Clara took. The steam helped, but the fever raged. Samuel worked with a desperate intensity, crushing herbs, mixing poultices, his face a mask of concentration. "Is she going to be all right?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. He met her eyes across the small space. "I'm doing everything I can." It wasn't an answer. Sometime before dawn, the fever finally broke. Clara fell into an exhausted, sweat-drenched sleep. Samuel slumped into a chair, the tension draining out of him, leaving him looking old and tired. "You saved her," Eleanor whispered. "Again." "Pneumonia comes and goes," he said, his voice weary. "She's not strong enough to travel. We can't leave tomorrow." Relief warred with guilt. "We're imposing. The child needs care," he said, as if it was the only thing in the world that mattered. He stayed up the rest of the night, watching. When morning came, pale and cold, Clara was breathing easier. The color had returned to her cheeks. As Samuel prepared coffee, their fingers brushed. The fleeting contact was like a spark, and Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked away, her cheeks burning. This was getting complicated. This strange, intense connection forged in crisis. She told herself it was just gratitude. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She told herself that as soon as Clara was well, they would leave. And she tried to ignore the unexpected pang of sadness that came with the thought. Later that day, when Samuel was outside, she found a small book of poetry on his shelf. It fell open to a page where a passage was underlined. "Though lovers be lost, love shall not," and death shall have no dominion. She put the book back, her heart aching for him, for the woman named Maria he had so clearly loved. When he returned, he seemed more relaxed. He answered Clara's questions about his dog, Ranger. He even began to carve her a small toy fox from a piece of wood. A fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over the cabin. It was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. Samuel was at the window in an instant, his face like thunder. 3 riders. One's wearing a military coat. He turned to her, his eyes cold and hard. From Silver Creek. Fear shot through Eleanor. Take Clara, he ordered, his voice low and urgent. The root cellar, under the floor behind the stove. Go now, and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear. He pulled the heavy stove aside, revealing a trap door. He lifted it, and a wave of cold, earthy air rose up. He handed her a blanket. Go. She scrambled down the ladder into the darkness, clutching Clara. What about you? She whispered. I'll handle them, he said, his face unreadable. They won't find you. He lowered the trapdoor, plunging them into a terrifying, smothering blackness. She heard the stove scrape back into place, heard his boots cross the floor, heard Ranger's low growl, quickly silenced. Then, a sharp, authoritative knock on the door. Reed! Samuel Reed! I know you're in there! Open up! In the name of the law! The voice. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She knew that voice, smooth, cultured, with an edge of pure steel. It was William Hammond, the mayor of Silver Creek, the man who had led the mob that killed her husband. Eleanor held her breath, her hand clamped over Clara's mouth. Through a thin crack in the floorboards she saw boots, Samuel's worn leather ones, and 3 pairs of polished riding boots. Mayor Hammond! Samuel's voice was flat, empty. An unexpected visit. I imagine it is, Hammond replied, his tone laced with false pleasantry. He paced the floor, his footsteps echoing right above them. We're looking for a woman, Reed, and Eleanor Hayes and her child. They disappeared during the storm. Haven't seen anyone in weeks, Samuel said. The woman is a troublemaker, Hammond said, his voice hardening. Took up with a Cheyenne buck. Disgraced her family. We can't have white women running off to live with savages. It sets a bad precedent. Ranger above them began to growl, a low, menacing sound. Eleanor's heart stopped. He doesn't like strangers, Samuel said calmly. Ranger, enough. The dog fell silent. Obedient beast, Hammond remarked. His boots stopped by the mantelpiece. Beautiful timepiece you have here. Silver, is it? Eleanor saw Samuel stiffen. It was my wife's. Ah, yes, Hammond said casually. Maria, the pretty little Mexican woman. A tragedy. What happened to her? How did he know about Maria? What did he know? If you've delivered your message, Mayor, Samuel said, his voice tight with a rage Eleanor could feel even through the floor. I'd appreciate it if you'd leave. As you can see, the woman isn't here. Of course, Hammond said, moving toward the door. He paused. But remember, Reed, no man is an island. We all have debts to pay. The door closed. The hoofbeats faded. After an eternity, the trapdoor opened. Samuel reached down, his face a grim mask. They're gone, he said. For now. He knew you, Eleanor said, her voice shaking as she climbed out. He knew about Maria. A muscle worked in Samuel's jaw. He touched the silver watch on the mantel. Hammond makes it his business to know everyone's weaknesses. What happened to her? Eleanor whispered. To Maria. Samuel stared into the fire, his face etched with a grief so profound it stole the air from the room. She was killed, he said, his voice rough. Our house was burned, with her inside it. His hands clenched into fists. I was away. I saw the smoke from miles off. By the time I got back, was it because she was Mexican? He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. That was their excuse. The real reason. She knew too much. She treated the wrong patient, heard things she shouldn't have. Just then, Clara coughed, a harsh, rattling sound. The cold from the cellar had seeped into her lungs. Samuel was at her side in an instant, his own pain forgotten. Her fever might return, he muttered. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes dark with a terrible certainty. You both need to leave. As soon as she's strong enough, Hammond won't stop looking. But why? Eleanor asked. Why is he so determined to find us? I think, she said slowly, a dreadful suspicion forming in her mind, he's afraid I know something about James's death, that it wasn't a mob, that it was murder. Samuel's hand stilled. Do you? I know James was meeting Hammond that night, she said. About a business arrangement. Something he said could change everything for us. Give us a chance to leave Silver Creek for good. Information, Samuel said grimly. That's the only currency Hammond deals in. Your husband must have learned something. Something Hammond wanted buried. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a new, terrifying light. My wife's death, your husband's, they're connected. Eleanor sank onto a stool, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Maria. What did she know? Samuel's face was a mask of cold fury. Everything, he said. She was a nurse in the war, too. She treated Hammond once. He had papers on him. Orders. Proof that he orchestrated a massacre and blamed it on Comanche raiders. 42 civilians dead. Women. Children. His voice was flat. Dead. Maria saw the papers. She never forgot. And years later, when we settled here, he found out she knew. And he burned your home, Eleanor finished, the horror of it making her sick. Samuel nodded. I was away. By the time I got back, it was too late. He looked at her, his expression dire. Hammond doesn't leave loose ends, Eleanor. We're loose ends, just like Maria and James were. Then we'll go, she said, her voice fierce. Far away, where he can't find us. He looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. We? All of us, she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. He stared at her for a long moment. It's a sound plan, he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. Safety in numbers. The next morning, as he carved the wooden fox for Clara, he told her his decision. Hammond will be back. This cabin isn't safe for any of us now. He looked at her, his gaze direct. I know these mountains. I can get you to Fort Benton, through the back ways. He was leaving his home, his sanctuary, the place he had built with Maria, because of them. This is all my fault, she whispered. No, he said, his voice soft. It was always going to happen. Hammond doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. They left before dawn the next day. Samuel carried a sleeping Clara, moving through the dense forest with an instinct that felt ancient. They walked in silence, every step taking them deeper into the wilderness and further from the life they had known. The journey was brutal. The cold was a constant enemy. But there were moments of unexpected beauty. A red fox darting through the trees, a frozen waterfall hanging like a glass sculpture, and through it all, a bond began to form, forged in shared danger and unspoken grief. They made it to an old trapper's cabin by the second afternoon, a crude shelter where they could rest for the night. As Clara slept, exhausted, Eleanor and Samuel sat by the fire. He was a good man, Samuel said, after she told him a story about James. The best I've ever known, she replied honestly. Until... She stopped, horrified at what she'd almost said. Until you. His hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning. He'd heard the unspoken words. Their eyes met, and in the flickering light, the air between them crackled with something new, something fragile and terrifying and hopeful. He cleared his throat. We should reach the ridge by tomorrow afternoon. Easier traveling after that. And then, she asked, in Fort Benton, what will you do? He stared into the fire. That depends, he said finally, on what you want, what you need. I need safety for Clara, she said. A place where she can grow up without being judged. And you, he pressed gently, what will you do? Start again, she whispered. Somehow. You could, he said, his voice hesitant. Your skills as a healer, they're too valuable to hide. Those skills didn't save Maria, he said, the old pain returning to his eyes. But they saved Clara, Eleanor reminded him. Twice. She took a breath. We face him together. Whatever comes, we're stronger together. His expression shifted. Surprise. Hope. Together, he repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. And then they heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. The jingle of harness bells. Samuel was on his feet, rifle in hand. Riders, he whispered, peering through a crack in the wall. Heading this way. Hammond, she breathed. We have to move. Now. He scooped up a sleeping Clara. There's a ravine behind the cabin. It leads to a cave system. We can hide there. They slipped out the back as the riders grew closer, scrambling down a steep, icy slope into a narrow cut in the earth. At the bottom, hidden behind a rockfall, was the mouth of a cave. They ducked inside, the air damp and cold. They're here, Samuel whispered minutes later, his hand finding hers in the darkness as voices echoed from above. Hammond's voice, directing his men. Check every hollow, he ordered. They can't have gone far. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. They were trapped. The ravine, sir? One of the men called. Should we check down there? There was a long pause. Eleanor squeezed Samuel's hand, her knuckles white. No, Hammond said finally. Too dangerous in this light. If they went that way, they're dead already. They waited in the darkness for what felt like a lifetime. They heard the men make camp in the cabin above. They would be there all night, watching, waiting. We need to move deeper, Samuel whispered. He led them through twisting passages, further and further into the earth, until they came to a chamber lit by a soft, eerie glow. Phosphorescent moss clung to the walls, casting the space in a magical, blue-green light. Earth magic, Samuel said, the cave's secret light. They spent the next day and night in that hidden chamber. They shared the last of their food. Samuel taught Clara a silent hand game to pass the hours. And in the soft, secret light, he told Eleanor how he had found this cave. He'd fallen into the ravine after Maria died, broken his leg, and dragged himself here to die. The light, he said, had felt like a sign, a reason to live. I wasn't really living, though, he confessed, his voice low and rough in the quiet chamber. Not until you knocked on my door. Not until Clara. The words hung between them, a fragile, beautiful thing. They slipped out of the cave the next night, moving like ghosts through the forest. They traveled all night, pushing higher into the mountains. By mid-morning, they reached a high, wind-swept pass. Avalanche territory, Samuel said grimly, but it's our only way. As they made their way through the narrow corridor of rock and snow, Ranger started to growl. Samuel looked back. Dark figures had appeared at the entrance to the pass. Hammond. How? Eleanor gasped. He has a tracker, Samuel said. We run. A deep rumble started, a vibration in the rock beneath their feet. The snow was unstable. Behind them, Hammond's voice echoed on the wind. Reed! There's nowhere to go! The rumbling became a roar. Down! Samuel screamed, shoving them behind a massive boulder as the world dissolved into a thundering white chaos. The avalanche ripped through the pass, a monstrous wave of snow and ice. Samuel threw his body over them, shielding them as the fury of the mountain tore past. When it was over, the pass was gone. Filled. Of Hammond and his men, there was no sign. They had vanished. They were safe. That night, they made a lean-to in the valley below. They had no food, no blankets, but Samuel, ever resourceful, caught a snowshoe hare in a trap he'd set on the way up. As Clara slept between them, Samuel's hand found hers in the darkness. I was not living, Eleanor, he whispered. You and Clara. You reminded me that there can be new beginnings. What kind of new beginning? She dared to ask. One with you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Both of you. If that's something you could want. It is, she breathed, very much. The next day they continued their journey. Hope was a tangible thing, warming them against the cold. They were going to make it. They were going to be a family. Around noon, Clara wandered a short distance away, chasing a butterfly. Then she screamed. They found her backed against a tree. A man stood over her, his face bruised and scratched, but unmistakably alive. It was Hammond. "What a delightful family reunion," he said, a pistol in his hand, aimed directly at Clara's head. "Let the child go, Hammond," Samuel snarled, his own rifle half raised. "Lower your weapon, Reed," Hammond warned, "or the half-breed dies first." Samuel slowly lowered his rifle, his face a mask of pure hatred. "That's better," Hammond smirked. "Now we're all going to take a little walk back to the pass. My men are waiting. We have a reckoning to attend to." "Your men survived?" Samuel asked, stalling. "Enough of them," Hammond admitted. "The avalanche just clipped us. We were luckier than you." He grabbed Clara's arm, yanking her forward. "Now move." They had no choice. As they trudged back up the slope, Hammond revealed the truth. James had been about to expose Hammond's wartime atrocities. Maria had been the source of the information. They were both loose ends he'd had to tie up. "And now you," he said, his voice cold. "The final loose ends." As they neared the avalanche site, two more men appeared from the rocks, rifles ready. They moved to tie up Samuel. In that instant, everything happened at once. A gray blur launched from the rocks. Ranger. The dog hit one of the men with silent fury, teeth sinking into his arm. Samuel dropped, tackling the second man. Hammond, startled, loosened his grip on Clara. Eleanor lunged, snatching her daughter. "Run, Clara! Run and hide!" The little girl scrambled for the trees. Hammond raised his pistol to fire at her, fleeing back. "No!" Eleanor screamed, throwing herself at him, grabbing his arm. The gun went off, the bullet burying itself in the snow. Hammond roared, striking her across the face. She fell. He stood over her, the pistol aimed at her heart. "A pity," he said. A single shot rang out. Hammond staggered, a look of pure shock on his face. A red flower bloomed on his chest. He looked down at it, then up at Samuel, who stood with one of the fallen men's rifles in his hands. "That," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet, "is for Maria." Hammond fell forward into the snow and did not move again. Clara ran from the trees, throwing herself into her mother's arms. It was over. It was finally, truly over. They left Hammond to the mountain and continued their journey. 2 days later, they stood on a ridge overlooking the bustling settlement of Fort Benton. A new life, a new beginning. Samuel's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her and Clara close. The wind was cold, but inside his embrace there was only warmth. He had once thought the best part of him died with Maria. But he was wrong. The best part is what remains, what chooses to go on living, what finds the courage, against all odds, to love again. What did you think of their story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the dark corners of the wilderness, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of survival and justice.